Hello students, Assalamu alaikum. Myself Naeem Amin Bhatti, and today the topic of our discussion is Browning and Arnold as early Victorian poets. In previous lecture, we have discussed Alfred Tennyson as an early Victorian poet. But today we are discussing the 3 points of our topic. The first one is the Robert Browning. He was a born poet, one of the most famous poets of the Victorian age. Matthew Arnold, a born poet and also a critic. He is mainly and chiefly famous for his criticism upon the different topics and the two of the minor poets. So let's start with the Robert Browning. Robert Browning was born on May 7, 1812 in Camberwell, a suburb area of London. It is near the London and a small town-like area in the United Kingdom, England. He and the younger sister, Serania, were the children of Robert Browning and Sarah Anna Browning. The father's name of Robert Browning was also Robert Browning, as you have read earlier that the father's name of John Milton was also John Milton. But here we are concerned with the Browning. So Sarah Anna Browning has a good deal of knowledge to transfer in Browning to brought up Browning and his younger sister. She given them a library consisting upon approximately 6,000 books. So it means that the poetry was in the blood of Robert Browning. Browning's father supported the family by working as a bank clerk and assembled a large library, some 6,000 books, which formed the foundation of the younger Browning's somewhat unconventional education. That was a part of education which was received by Browning from his parents. And that is a form of luck, that when a person receives genetically some type of knowledge from his parents, and also in the form in the early childhood, in the form of the nourishment, the knowledge is granted to that student or that particular children is always a source of pleasure. Browning was married to the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning in 1846. She was also an early Victorian poet, basically a poetess, a female poet. And remember to know that, and a point to know that, point to remember that is that she was also nominated for the Poet Laureate of England, but she was not selected as a Poet Laureate because Tennyson was selected as a Poet Laureate at that time. So, so far so good. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was having a peculiar taste in his subject matters of poetry. English poet and playwright Robert Browning was a master of the dramatic verse and is perhaps best known for his 12 book long poems, that is, A Ring and the Book. It consists of the 12 books, and one of his most notable and most famous works of the Browning. So let's have a look upon the works of Browning. Robert Browning's Paralysis, published in 1835, received good reviews. It doesn't mean that before 1835 he wasn't writing any type of the poetry, but he was penning some of his poems in his personal capacity, or he was practicing as a poet. But his work was published in 1835. The next poem was Sordello, and critics dislike it. Why critics dislike it? There was a main reason of obscurity, that Browning is also famous for his obscure poems. the poems which doesn't gives the reader the proper understanding. There was a difficulty to understand the poet's intentions, that what he's gonna say about the particular subject matter. That was obscurity, that was called obscure at that time. So in 1840, he published Sordello, and the critic doesn't give it much attention because that was a condition, the lack of understanding in that poem, the lack of necessary informations. The poet wanna describe something to the reader but couldn't describe properly in detail, so that was called obscure. In 1830s, Browning was tried to write plays for the theatre but did not succeed and so moved on. It doesn't mean that he was not succeeded in writing the theatres, but it means that the plays written at that time were not up to the mark of the requirements of the theatres at that time. So he continued towards the poetry. In 1860s, he published the Dramatis Personae. As the word describes itself, that dramatis was related to the drama, but it was a poetical work. It was in the form of dramatic poetry, which had both of the first and the second edition and was admired by the critics. In 1868-69, he published the 12 volumes, The Ring and the Book, which some critics believed to be his greatest work. They thought that it was the Browning's greatest work, and which earned the poet's popularity for the first time. He was recognized for the first time. And he was not only recognized, but he was a famous poet at that time in 1868-69 when he written The Ring and the Books. The Paid Paper of Hamlin, published in the Dramatic Lyrics in 1842. The poem was not one of the Brownings deemed consequential, however, it was one of the most famous poem at that time in 1842. So here are the works of Browning. Pauline was published in 1833, important work. Paracelsus, as we have talked about, 1835. Sordello was an obscure type of work, was published in 1840. Pippa Passes, one of his most important and most noteworthy poem, 1841. Dramatic Lyrics is a collection of lyrical poetry which was also practiced by the Tennyson. It was also practiced by William Wordsworth in the form of lyrical ballads. You have studied about it earlier. The dramatic lyrics was about the lyrical poetry, and the lyrical poetry is a form of poetry which could be performed on the melody, which could be sing on the melody. Dramatic romances and the lyrics was published in 1845. Men and Women was published in 1855. Dramatis Personae was published in 1864, and Dramatic Idyllists was published in 1879-80. Some of his important dramatic lyrics are Bishop Orders His Tomb. That is a poem in which there are the number of obscure verses. A bishop calls upon his nephews, and he says them that what kind of the resting in peace place he is going to be imagined. He told them his tomb should be one of the greatest tombs of the bishops. He orders them to brought out the lapis lazuli to put in his tomb. So there are some conditions which he imposes on his slaves and his nephews to make his tomb. The next one was two in the gondola and Porphyra's lover, Fra Lippo Lippi, the last ride together, Child Roland, to a dark tower came. Grammarian Funeral, Rabbi ben Ezra, Prosperous, and My Last Ashes. Browning's obscurity and dramatic monologue. We have discussed about this. Dramatic monologue has been described to you earlier, but here is a proper definition for obscurity and dramatic monologue. You can say that it was his chief fault and his chief properties of his poetry, the chief characteristic of his poetry also, because fault can also be a characteristic in some manner. This is mainly due to the fact that his thought is often so obscure or subtle that the language cannot express it perfectly. That there is an idea, but language cannot fulfill the requirements to describe that idea. Now we move towards the dramatic monologue. Robert Browning secured his place as a prominent poet with dramatic monologue to form mastered for which became known and influential. Now this is the definition of the dramatic monologue, that a dramatic monologue in a dramatic monologue a character speaks to listener from his or her subjective point of view. In doing so, the character often reveals insights about him or herself, often more than intended. That he reveals some informations about himself or herself. His later life and death. In 1881, Browning Society was founded to further study the poet's work and also to analyze the works of the poet who was writing at that time. In 1887, Browning received an honorary DCL or Doctor of Civil Law from Balliol College at Oxford University. Browning continued to publish poetry with his final work, Azulando, published on the day he died. He was died on December 12, 1889 in Venice and was buried in the Poets' Corner in Westminster's Abbey, where the other poets are also buried. So, one of the most famous poet, and the death was also a big loss for the English literature. Our next poet is Matthew Arnold, born in December 24, born on December 24, 1822 in Laleham, England, which is a small town on the bank of River Thames near London. His father, Thomas Arnold, conducted a school there. He was a school teacher. Later, he was made a headmaster in the rugby school. And his mother, Mary Penrose Arnold, and she was also the daughter of an Anglican clergyman. So, there was a good deal of knowledge to the parents of Matthew Arnold. That's why he got the knowledge genetically from his parents. He was sent away for 2 years, 1831 to 1832, to his uncle's strict school at Lilham. And Arnold, go, he was a great admirer of Wordsworth, and he was agree upon the concept of nature given by Wordsworth, but he was against about the ornate and the fluent romanticism of Shelley and Keats. So, a poet, a critic, at a one time at one hand he is agree upon the romanticism, but on other hand he is not agree with the romanticism. So that is a power of criticism, that he always criticizes the works of the other writers positively also and also negatively. Beside being a poet, Arnold was a great critic of poetry. So, works of Arnold, there are the early poems like the Shakespearean sonnets, which deserves the highest place. It is the most magnificent epigraph and introduction to the works of Shakespeare. Another poem of great charm and beauty is Requisite, and which is the execute dirge, means in the form of destructive poetry, the poetry depiction having the depiction of some destructive thoughts. In his longer poems, Strayed Reveler, Empedocles, and on Atna, Sohrab, and Rustam, the Scholar Gypsy. The Scholar Gypsy is the poem about a character who went to the London for the fulfillment of his educational requirements to get education, but there he was wandering about in the lanes of London. That's why he was called the Scholar Gypsy. Tharis's, that is an elegy on Claw. His friend Claw was died. So in 1850, in between 1850s and 60s, so which is considered one of the same rank as Milton's Lycidas and Shelley's Adonis. It is the lyrical strain into which the poet breaks now and then and which gives them the peculiar charm. It is the same lyrical note in the poem of the Forsaken Merman, which is the piece of exquisite, a restrained but melodious, passionate music. Forsaken Merman is a uh, male of mermaid, and it lives in the sea, inside the water of sea, under the water of sea, and it comes to the seashore to see his girlfriend on the seashore, and it is a love affair between a female from the humankind, from the humans, and a male from the sea creatures. And his famous work, Dover Beach, gives the expression of Arnold's peculiar religious attitude in an age of doubt. And a fine summer night, the memorial verse which immediately appeals towards the reader. Most of his poetry gives the expression of the conflict of that age. Most of the writers, particularly the poets, were writing at that time in the form of the conflictive parameters, like there is a conflict between the spontaneity and discipline, between emotion and reason, and between faith and skepticism. Some of his other works are Empedocles and Etna 1852, Essays on the Criticisms 1865, Culture and Anarchy 1869, The Function of Criticism 1865, and The Study of Poetry 1880. He was died due to the heart failure in spring of 1888 at Liverpool and was buried at Laleham with three sons. His three sons was died earlier, and that is a moment of grief when a father sees his son on the deathbed. Early loss and shadowed his life. The hills where his life rose and the sea where it goes. It all depends upon us that we brought up in hills, but at last, due to the death, we are going to die like sea in a sea, like a person died in a sea, like a person drowns in a sea, and there will be nothing which represents us at last. Some of the minor poets, Elizabeth Barrett, 1806 to 61, she was the wife of Browning. That is enough for her introduction. Her works are The Cry of Children, Cowper's Grave, and her sonnets from the Portuguese. And the friend of Arnold, Arthur Hugh Clarke, 1819 to 1861. His works are Dicicus and the body of Trobrana Wallace. So that's it from today's lecture. Hope that you have understand it well. If there is some type of confusion, you can ask me in comment box. So now till for the further lecture, it's goodbye from me. Thanks a lot and Allah Hafiz.